So we ended the last discussion by pointing out that for the absolutists there had to be a sovereign, but that the sovereign had to be a body or an individual within the state whose voice was ratified as the guiding voice in the making and imposition of law, being accepted on all sides and operating without external constraint, at least of an uncontracted kind. But I emphasize the voice had to be a voice within the state that was ratified in order to count as the voice of the polity, the sovereign voice. Now I'm going to introduce a criticism of that point of view, and ultimately what I'm going to try to argue is that, of course, there is a sovereign, even in a decentralized state, provided it's a fairly effective state, of course, but having a decentralization, having a mixed constitution, doesn't undermine the possibility of sovereignty. And I'm also going to address the issue about whether the sovereign in a decentralized state could count as the people. And that's going to raise the issue with populism, as I described it. But first of all, let me remind you, if you don't know it already, of a story told by Gilbert Ryle, the Oxford philosopher, in his book called The Concept of Mind. So Ryle, in that book, he says, there's a story going around about a visitor who comes to Oxford. Now remember, Oxford is a federated university. It grew out of and it was established by the different colleges, which are themselves of varying ages. Some colleges go back to the 1200s, some to the 1300s, some were established only as recently as the last century. And the story he tells is a visitor comes to Oxford, asked to be shown around, and he's taken to all of the colleges, the 30 or something colleges. And then he says, that's terrific, but now I've seen the colleges, could you show me the university? Now, for Ryle, for anyone who knows Oxford, that's, so to speak, a solecism, as we call it in English. It's a bad mistake. It's a fallacy because it doesn't recognize the nature of the federated nature, as I call it, of Oxford University. It supposes that the university is an entity, so to speak, coordinate with the colleges. So you see college A, B, C, D, and then you see the university, so to speak, which is a building, an entity at the same level, in that sense, coordinate with the colleges. But of course, the joke is, about that story in The Visitor, is that the university is not coordinate with the colleges. It's not of the same order or level as the colleges. It's not a concrete entity like the individual colleges are. Rather, the university is, as we say, constituted by the colleges. The university is, as you might put it, an abstract institutional entity that exists insofar as the colleges exist and insofar as those colleges have relationships with one another, whereby they each go along with procedures determining who are the faculty to teach, who are the students, and what do the students have to do in order to count as gaining a degree, as it will be called, a degree not from a particular college, but from the university. The word universitas, actually, in Latin, in medieval Latin in particular, when the universities were developed, meant a unity out of many. And the universitas was basically the unification of the colleges, but the university is not something, as I say, on the same level of the colleges. What you might put is to say that the university is is a superordinate entity. It exists on the basis of the existence of the colleges and the interactions between the colleges. And it isn't something over and above them. Actually, Ryle's reason for using the story was he wanted to argue that the mind of a human being like one of us, the story is told in a book called The Concept of Mind, that the mind is not something you might, so to speak, open up the head and see. You'd see this part of the brain, the cerebellum, the cerebrum, the frontal cortex, and so on, and oh, there's the mind. That would be a silly mistake. It would be to take the mind to be coordinate with the other parts of the brain and the other parts of the organism, the nervous system. Whereas Ryle wanted to suggest that the mind was something more abstract. Of course, that someone has a mind and acts on that mind is grounded in how those parts of the brain interact with one another and the role they play within the nervous system and in generating action and in taking in, processing information via the senses and so on. But the mind is something over and above, not something mysterious. It's not as if it's, as Descartes, for example, thought, a special entity over and above that's just connected by contingent linkages with the brain. No, the mind is the brain. It relates to the brain the way in which you might say a tune, a melody relates to the grooves on a record or the markings on the electronic configuration of a CD, a compact disc. It's something that depends on the other for its existence, but is not of a kind with them, not of a level with them. Actually, the mistake that basically the visitor to Oxford is making, and the mistake as Ryle would have thought that Descartes made about the mind, was a mistake that A.N. Whitehead, the great mathematician and philosopher, described as a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The idea being that there's an abstract entity there, in Ryle's case the mind, in the visitor's case the university, and it's a fallacy to think that it must be as concrete, so to speak, as the concrete entities on whose existence and interrelationship it depends. So that's basically what the visitor is doing, and that is what Descartes was doing by Ryle's perception. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that the absolutists, when they argue that the sovereign voice in the polity has got to be the voice of a single individual within that polity, the monarch, or of a body within that polity, like the legislature or the administration, that it has to be, the sovereign has to be that entity, and the voice of that entity has to be the sovereign voice, they were equally committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They were assuming that the sovereign has to be one amongst the various bodies that operate within the state. It'd be like thinking that the mind has to be one of the parts within the body, or the university has to be one of the colleges, or at least something side by side and like the colleges. It's to think that the sovereign can't be something that's constituted by the different agencies within the state that interact with one another, and the different officials, individuals in the state that interact with one another. And that's simply an error, I think. I mean, it's certainly not necessarily the case that the sovereign, assuming now that there has to be a sovereign, and remember, a sovereign is an agent or agency that dictates the law without external uncontracted constraint and with the general acceptance of the people. It's a mistake to think that, assuming there has to be a sovereign, which I think there has to be, it's a mistake to think that that sovereign has to be identifiable with some part, so to speak, of the state, with some individual or agency that operates inside the state. That mistake, I think, was probably made was made readily by the absolutists insofar as they adopted the view that you can have a group operating only insofar as you have a voice. Sorry, you can have a sovereign operating only insofar as you have a body with a voice. The individual has the individual voice that can then be ratified by the populace of the voice of the state. The individual agency, like the legislature, has a voice created by majority voting, as they all thought, that can be ratified by the populace as the voice of the state. And they said, wait a moment, the mixed constitution, there are all these voices. There's a cacophony, a clamour of different voices. There is no single voice to be ratified as the sovereign voice. And so they reject it. And in rejecting it, they're basically committing to the view that the sovereign, i.e. the agency with that voice, has to be one of the individuals or one of the bodies, the agencies operating within the state itself. I said that on their view, the voice to be made into the sovereign voice has to be pre-existing, an individual's voice, the voice determined by the majority, and is then ratified, so to speak, after the event by the members of the state, of the population, the subjects. But here's another possibility, that the voice that can be regarded as the voice dictating the law without external and contractual constraint may be a voice that emerges, that is constructed by these different parts of the state operating together. After all, let's go back to the university example. You can imagine, it's not quite true, I think, today, but you can imagine that certainly at a certain point in the evolution of the University of Oxford or any of those federated older universities like Cambridge, for example, you might assume that at a certain point, as they organize themselves into a university, giving degrees, admitting students, that at a certain point they basically, they had different views in the different colleges, but they established a procedure whereby they could be brought to agreement and a single voice constructed by them. And that's really the possibility of having a superordinate voice, such that the university would be the body with that voice existing over and beyond the colleges. And similarly, I want to put before you the abstract, at any rate, possibility that the agencies within a state and the individuals, the citizens or subjects within the state, would so relate to one another, follow such procedures or protocols, that they would create a single voice by which they could all navigate, and in particular a single voice that would establish what the law is. Now, with that in mind, think, for example, of ancient Rome, as I described it, Republican Rome. I said that it had to be one of the elite administrators who would also be a member of the Senate, who proposed a law, but that in order for something to become law, it had to be accepted as law by one of a number of popular bodies, say in particular the Tribal Assembly, as it was called, or sometimes the Centuriate Assembly. But already there, notice that there isn't a body with an existing voice that is being ratified by the people of Rome as the source of law. There are two bodies that play a part in dictating what the voice of the law shall be. There's the elite administrator, or body of administrators, who propose a law, and then there's a body of the people in the assemblies who decide whether or not it will be law. So that's a straightforward, simple example of two bodies acting together to generate a voice that will then be, or can then be, accepted by the people as a whole as the voice of law. And that already, even that element in Rome, means that there was a mixed constitution there, that there was a degree of decentralization. And of course, on this picture now, who is sovereign? Well, it's not that the Senate or the administrators are sovereign, and it's not that the collective tribal assembly or centuriate assembly is sovereign. Rather, what's sovereign is none of those bodies, but a higher superordinate body that they all constitute, the city of Rome. And they constitute that city or that state insofar as they act together, coordinated under various procedures and protocols, to identify what the law is in any case and how the law is to be empowered. The sovereign is a superordinate sovereign, not any particular part of the state, but rather the polity as a whole, the state as a whole, operating on the basis of its parts, interacting with one another in that particular way. I think, for example, of the United States, which is a good example of a mixed constitution, a radically mixed constitution. Actually, for the record, in my own view, I think it's an extreme version of a mixed constitution, and I think a moderate version of a kind you get in parliamentary democracies probably works better. But think about the United States. In order for something to become law, it has to be agreed to by each of two different houses of Congress, and then it has to be agreed to by the president. He can veto any law, remember. That's three parties that are involved in constructing the law, and therefore the voice, so to speak, behind which people can rally and recognizing that's the law, that's what we have to conform to. But also there's a fourth body involved, because any individual in the United States with legal standing, as they say, can challenge a law proposed by these three bodies before the federal courts, ultimately the Supreme Court, on the grounds that it is inconsistent with the basic laws of the state, which are those established in the Constitution that was originally approved in 1787 in the various conventions in the country, and that has been amended in various ways since. And the Supreme Court can strike down a law, which means that it also has to come on side before something is recognized as law. So that's exactly different bodies and agencies interacting in order to create a voice that can be regarded then by people as the voice of the polity or the state, the sovereign voice. And of course, it is a voice that does dictate what the law is and how the law is to be imposed. And it does that, notice, without external constraint, at least of a sort that's uncontracted. I need to qualify that in a little while, but for the moment let that pass. And of course it does it with the general acceptance of the people in the state. So it's exactly a sovereign emerging that's grounded in a mixed constitutional arrangement, but that doesn't sort of reduce to any part of that arrangement. When Ryle's visitor said, but whereas the university had made a mistake, someone would make the same mistake if they looked at the United States. They looked at the different houses of Congress, the presidency, the courts, and they said, fine, I've seen all of the bodies, but now where is the sovereign? They'd be making a mistake. Not any one of them is sovereign. Something that emerges from the interaction of those various elements is the sovereign. It's a superordinate sovereign. So I hope this makes clear the sort of argument for a consistency thesis against the absolutists. You can have a mixed constitution, you can have decentralization, and you can still have sovereignty. Now, that might seem like a very abstract argument of mainly only historical significance in relation to the absolutists. And after all, in a way, they were proved wrong in practice by the fact that states grew up that had mixed constitutions that did not conform to the absolutist template or frame. That meant that it failed in practice. What I've just been showing is that their view also fails in theory. There is no reason why there shouldn't be a sovereign under a mixed constitution. But let me continue now, because this debate is still relevant today, because it's raised by the populist movement in various democracies. So what the populist movement say is this: look, in a democracy, the people are supposed to be sovereign. And then they say, the people would be sovereign only if the electorate were sovereign, because that's when the people act collectively together. And they would be sovereign insofar as they determined who was to speak for them, who was to be the leader. Now, all populists seem to think that ideally you should have a single leader, certainly the populist leaders think this, who is, so to speak, given authority by the electorate and who speaks in the name of the electorate as the sovereign of the state. And all populists say that democracy is compromised if there are, for example, independent courts that can strike down what the elected legislators, the leader and the leader's supporters in Parliament, actually vote for. And they say that's a non-democratic restriction on the power of the people. And insofar as there is that decentralization that gives such powers to unelected judges, the people are not sovereign. And equally, they say, insofar as a democracy allows for groups like non-governmental and therefore unelected organizations to challenge government in the streets or in the media or indeed in the courts, because they are not the people, they don't speak for the people in the electoral way. They are also a constraint on the rule of the people, and it means that the people are not properly sovereign. Now, of course, the mistake, I think, that populists are making is to think that the sovereign has got to be an entity within the state. In their case, it has to be the people assembled on election day, radiating their power, so to speak, investing their power in the figure of the leader or the leading party. And that's simply a mistake. It's actually a double mistake. First of all, it's the same mistake as absolutists in thinking that the sovereign has to be a part of the state, coordinate with other bodies in the state, rather than recognizing that it may be superordinate to the operations of the state. But secondly, it's a mistake in thinking that the electorate really is a body that could serve as sovereign anyhow. I mean, as they themselves say, it serves just to establish the leader and the leader's party in power. But that's really like serving to establish a dictator. I mean, in these populist democracies, these autocratic democracies as they're often now called, what they're pushing towards is a rule in which elections, and we can only hope that they're free and fair and universal elections, just serve every 3 or 4 or 5 years to select the leader's group, and then that leader is, so to speak, dictator. He or she is the sovereign for the period between elections. Actually, it's a regime that was described by Thomas Jefferson back in the 18th century as an elective despotism. It was described later in the 20th century by a conservative, Lord Hailsham, in Britain, as an electoral dictatorship. So it's really ironic that populists should think that's what true democracy would be, and this decentralized democracy, this supposed mixture of elections with unappointed officials that can check and balance those elected, that's really denying people their power. Now, of course, I want to say that that's really not the case, or at least not necessarily the case. I'm not saying that every state that has a decentralized system of government, but also has elections, therefore makes the people sovereign. I think that many democracies fail to do that because those who are in power, in office, are too much, so to speak, under the control of, say, the wealthy, the rich, or the influential, the culturally, so to speak, privileged. I'm not saying that always a decentralized electoral regime gives the people proper sovereignty. But I think that a decentralized democracy can make the people into the sovereign, and it will do so insofar as there is enough control by ordinary people over both the elected authorities but also the unelected authorities and the way government operates. Do you remember I said at one point that on the Greek understanding of democracy, unlike the understanding of Baudin, who wanted to make democracy seem infeasible, democracy means a system in which ordinary people have a lot of power. Well, we can easily see what it would be for a decentralized state to give people a lot of power, to give them enough power for us to be able to say that this is a democracy, to be able to give them enough power to be able to say that the polity, the state itself, just is the people, incorporated under the procedures and the constraints dictating how the different individuals and bodies will act. So let me just sketch a sort of example or a picture of a state where I think you might have decentralization and the sovereignty of the people. First of all, the state would have to be a state in which ordinary people dictate the Constitution and can amend the Constitution without too much difficulty. There has to be some procedures in place to do it, but at least it's not unrevisable in practice. So the people are in control of the Constitution. It's constitutional control. But equally, that Constitution does have to give people, collectively, the right to elect in competitive elections the domain general authorities, the legislators, the main administrators. It equally should give people the right to be able to oversee, see what's happening, the appointment of domain-specific authorities like judges and people in the Bureau of Statistics and so on. That should all be public. It should give people the right to establish constraints on those in government, like rule of law constraints, so that they can't abuse the office and the power they have. And it should give people a capacity to form non-governmental organizations and to keep track of government and to challenge government when they feel that government is not acting appropriately, and to challenge it publicly, where everyone can join in the debate. Now, in such a democracy, with a constitutional, electoral, constraining and contestatory aspect, I think that people could be said to be sovereign. So I think that the argument we've gone through not only undermines the position of the traditional absolutists in thinking that decentralization rules out all sovereignty, it also undermines the position of the populists. Decentralization is consistent with sovereignty, and in particular it's consistent with the sovereignty of the people. That will be assured insofar as there are suitable electoral, contestatory and constraining arrangements in place. Then the people will be the polity. They will rule through the polity. It will be their political organization. Thank you very much.